Okay, welcome back, Violent Earthers. This week's material, as promised, poison gases. Poison gas. If it wasn't asteroid impacts or continual volcanism or a giant moon-forming impact, let's talk about some poison gas. Who doesn't love poison gas in a violent story? So it turns out, and you can probably read this already behind me, it turns out this poison gas is something that you need to survive. Oxygen. Free oxygen in the atmosphere. 2 oxygen molecules, those ones from the periodic table, bonded together to make a specific oxygen molecule, not just 2 atoms, but those 2 atoms together to make a molecule that is very poisonous to a lot of non-anaerobic bacteria. Okay? So in this material, we're going back. So we ended last time at asteroids and the mass extinctions of the dinosaurs. But what we haven't really done in Violent Earth yet is talk about just life. Life in general. So we've done beasts of the Pleistocene and a little bit about dinosaurs. But let's go back to the beginning of life, talk a little bit about early life and the fossil record, early life and the evidence that we have of that, and the Hadean period, what that sort of looked like and how that could set the stage for early life. And then we will then discuss these really peculiar rocks that do have within them some signature of life. Actually, a new life, a different life. All right. Now, before get too far ahead of ourselves in the oxygen story, here's our kind of spiral of events that we've been through. Cosmic web. This seems like weeks ago now. Of course it was, right? Our cosmic web, accretionary disk, thermonuclear generator of the sun, making some helium out of hydrogen, fusion together, which creates all this mass, this wonderful light and energy around us. The planet and the smaller planetesimal Theia caught up in that accretionary disk collided for our first really big violent event 4.48 billion years ago, the giant impact hypothesis. Then we discussed the layered Earth and some of the evidence for a layering of Earth, of this planet and of all planets. And then it's this layering and some of that earlier history that sets up just the functioning of Earth. How does Earth function on its own after this violent origin story, this early history? And that led us to a discussion in plate tectonics, at least eventually, and just generally minerals, what minerals are made of, chemically, what the Earth looks like, to paint this kind of general story of business as usual. This is business as usual Earth that we've gone through with quiescent crust and some of that sort of average volcanism, even though to us it's chaos, right, or it's catastrophic, like say the Pinatubo eruption. But that's business as usual, plate tectonic Earth. We did stick in there a few nice violent events, the snowball Earth hypothesis and Pleistocene glacial ice ages that relate back there to this story, to what are, rather than Earth's just internal inner working mechanisms. Remember, it is still a part of this bigger heliosphere system that has major influence. In the case here that we looked at, the eccentricity of its orbit, right, and the changes there over 100,000-year cycle, or the change of the tilt of the axis back and forth, and between 22 degrees and 24 degrees. Well, I did that kind of backwards, but that also leads to a cycle, and then also that the tilt that appears to wobble like a top after it goes around in this orbit before it changes. So all these cycles that lead to lower solar luminosities, lower amounts of light that are heating up the Earth's atmosphere that have put us into these glacial ice ages in the past. So violent cold event. We went from violent hot asteroid impacting events, or planet impacting events, cold, and then we came back here for a little while to asteroids. Now that we have a functioning Earth business as usual type of system, we can look at these punctuated events that are really violent to things. And what came out of the discussion, of course, with Chicxulub impact crater, the mother of all asteroids, if you want to speak of it that way, because it's so familiar to us, it wiped out those dinosaurs, right? Those beloved reptilian creatures, the long necks that no longer are around because of a big bad asteroid that knocked them out of the park. We're going to continue with these catastrophic events now. A lot of the first 5 weeks of the course, there were some catastrophic big things that we've been talking about, but we also spent a lot of time just with getting to know Earth as what it looks like when it's not catastrophic, so we can appreciate the major violent events, I think. And from here, I again want to keep continuing to paint this picture of the violent punctuating events that have happened to Earth in the background of most of Earth's time is business as usual. The last 4.6 billion years are a time of a quiescent Earth, kind of. I'm maybe overstating that from our eyes, but in the Earth system. All right, so that's our spiral of where we have been and kind of a little seed of where we're going, right? We're really going to continue on with these violent Earth catastrophes. Just as the other day at the end of last lecture, I dropped in a little bit about material before, about plate tectonics and supercontinents. This is a relatively, fairly newish paper, couple years old. But I thought it was very relevant for the end of that discussion on supercontinents of the Pangaea Ultima, or the future supercontinent that some people some people have thought about. And it turns out there's a good scientific argument. Of course, there is a very good scientific argument about the other images that I showed you. But this was a relatively recent paper that's using mantle downwelling flow of a different mechanism rather than the crustal faults or the age of the oceanic lithosphere that I was using earlier to support the formation of a supercontinent in 250 million years from now. In this paper, they term amnesia, and if you'll notice, the configuration here has Africa and South America on completely opposite sides of the globe, which is not what the image of Pangaea Ultima looks like, which would represent ideas from, say, 10, 20, 30 years ago of how this configuration will change in the next 250 million years. I bring that up as two ways to show, or as a way, not only is this current and interesting fun science, but also this is the future we're talking about, right? Pangaea Ultima, amnesia. We're trying to use our current knowledge and project forward, just as today in the present, the geological sciences, we're using the rocks and the rock record of Earth to look in the past. The difference here is the future has multiple pathways and is really, we can only extrapolate from here into the unknown. But the past actually does have the trail of history, the path that leads to today. And that's what we're trying to do in the rock record, is describe the path that the past has been on. And we're also able then to know the past and past events to compare to things that can and could happen, or what the early warning signals and signs might be. I just think that that's an interesting way to look at how we're projecting geology into the future as well. Okay, so on to today's major subject material then. Let's start here, back at the origins of the solar system. So now we're after the giant impact with the moon forming event, and now Earth and Moon are working into their toddler stage, let's say, maybe, if this is like an analogy to a human child. That now they're mature, they're outside, they're formed, and now they are at the whim of their own system, right? What's going to happen to their internal system? The Hadean, as you might well have formed already, Hades, the Greek god of the underworld or of hell, today the monotheistic perspective of a hell or an underworld that Satan or the devil or some entity like this holds the keys to or overlooks the souls. Hades or hell have a lot of similarities there. So Hadean, or the Hadean, is roots to that time of a hell-like earth or hell on earth, between that formation and even including the giant impact event, which is pretty hellish, moving up to about 4 billion years ago. And we had also picked up on this story when we talked about the formation of oceanic crust during the Archean. And that's one of the main divisions between the Hadean and the Archean, is the rise of continents, or the rise of lithosphere that is more continental or more silicic lithosphere, and breaking even into plates. It may not be plate tectonics, as we looked at in that lecture, between the Archean and the Proterozoic types of crust. But anyway, we're going back beyond that now, back to the Hadean, to look at life, the inhospitability to life in general. I mean, this is hell on earth. This is the death of everything that we know of. And think about, when we think of life and living things, you may think of green plants or yourself, maybe susceptible to heat or dehydration or lack of water. But even those extreme bits of life, like say viruses or bacteria, we know that they have limits and we can kill them with maybe some UV pin in the water, right? Or some iodine tablets. So my point here is our perception of life is that life is fairly delicate, right? I mean, we can kill fish in a fish tank using a copper penny, right? I mean, copper, please don't try that at home. Bad example, maybe. That we can kill things so easily with poisons that it appears to us today that life is fragile. And really, I'm not arguing against that case, that the ecosystem, the plethora and biodiversity of life is fairly fragile, the web of life. But life in itself is a really, really, really robust part of this earth, just like the earth itself. We see that we've gone through this catastrophe, all these catastrophes, violent events of earth, but earth is always, of course, big and rebounding to these events. And what I want to do now is look at life in this context of how robust life is for the last 4 billion years. But first, we go to this point where there is no life, or life as we know it, it's very inhospitable to that. But now we should talk about, well, what is the origin of life? What do we know about when life got to start and how life got to start? And the geological sciences, as you can imagine, has much less to say about this than, at least to a certain extent, than, say, the biological sciences, or biochemistry, or even astrobiology, that is informed by all of these others, paleontology of the geosciences, and biochemistry. Astrobiology would be informed by these, but astrobiology even has maybe more to work with than we in the geosciences that work with rocks. So what we're going to look at here is the rock record of life. What is it that the memory, the silicate memory of Earth the rocks are preserving to inform us about life. Okay. Now, one thing then we can probably agree on is that life, as we do think of it, this would be inhospitable conditions, and this is about 1 billion years before we have hard rock evidence for life to be prolific enough to show up in the fossil record. Okay. All right, long-winded as always, but now let's talk about how life maybe does get a foothold after the Hadean time period. And there is the first of these models, which I think is very, very interesting, if not the most interesting of these hypotheses. But I'll talk about the one, maybe not flaw from my perspective, but of, let's just lay it out there. It still leaves us with the question of how does life form, okay? But maybe life on this planet, on planet Earth, has extraterrestrial origins. And that word, remember, extraterrestrial, we use that to describe the asteroid that came to Earth, because extra, outside, terra, Earth, outside of the planet. So in this idea, which is called panspermia, or pan for all, like Pangea, spermia, seeded, that all life was actually seeded on this planet. That during the Hadean, or potentially even earlier, though of course the rock record would have little to say about that, but if the biologists say it could possibly be so, that somewhere in those Hadean hell Earth this could occur, if life was brought here by comets or meteors or asteroids, even at the smallest fundamental amounts. I mean, that's really all we need to get a lot of kickstart this, is some proteins and some amino acids and some of those fundamental building blocks. So the idea of panspermia is that life did not originate here on this planet, as we'll talk about the next set of hypotheses, but instead was transported here from somewhere else. Or transported maybe is a bad word, because that implies maybe beams, or beam me up, Scotty, or something like that, or a conscience force. But instead, by an asteroid or a comet, an accidental appearance to this planet, which would also suggest then that Mars, Venus, Titan, any of the other worlds of this solar system could have also had the same impacts or life-bringing events. Panspermia happened to those places, but uniquely life is the only one with them today, as far as we know, to our exploration. So this would definitely suggest that life is all over in, or has the potential to be all over in the cosmos. And is much older than our 4.6 billion year old history on this planet, but instead could be potentially 10 billion years old, or 14 billion years old, almost as old as the universe itself. And that life maybe looks very different from the type of life that we have here. So there's a lot of food for fodder there. It's very, very interesting. But as I said, the one thing that panspermia always leaves me with is, how does life form? This doesn't explain that, notice that. This explains how life got here on this planet, but doesn't really say anything about its formations elsewhere. So I can address that when I get to my preferred hypothesis in a minute, how that actually still answers this question. But if we look at other means that have been used to describe life's origin on this planet, they don't deal with that question quite as well, because they're looking at carbon-based life, or not just carbon-based life, but carbon-based life as it exists on this planet. Bacteria, viruses, proteins, amino acids, so on and so forth. Okay, so let's look at a different working hypothesis for the origins of life here on Earth. And that is the most common that you hear of in, I would say, everyday, your lay science even to the biology textbooks of college, the general hypothesis that's put forward is, and I kind of term it here, the warm little pond. I don't know, I remember hearing it that way when I was younger, and that's one of those terminologies that's always stuck with me. But this is like that, the proverbial primordial soup, right? Or the ocean of chemistry that allowed amino acids, or maybe not allowed, but set up the conditions that amino acids and proteins and all of this stuff could start forming. And I think that that's the preferred, maybe not the terminology, but that certainly is the prevailing materialistic scientific way of looking at the origins of life on this planet. And a lot of that goes back to an experiment in 1952, 1954 called the Urey-Miller experiment, the Urey-Miller synthesis, which we'll take a look at here in a second. To at least I think they're on these slides. If not, this is very accessible material in biology textbooks. It's there as a cultural meme to us. I think, from my perspective, that this is out there a lot. Now, another hypothesis then, working hypothesis then, number 3, was really popular in the late 1980s through the 1990s. This was something that, to me, in my life sciences textbook in like 5th grade, I remember this being proposed as an alternative to this idea. Was that at that time, or just before, I think in the late 80s, submersibles had made it to extreme depths of the ocean, maybe not made it to extreme depths, but have gone to explore the areas of rifting on the ocean floor, where, of course, the asthenosphere is upwelling, and that's causing the whole ophiolite sequence. And on top of the ophiolite sequence, one thing we didn't talk about is the water that's percolating down through the rocks, but it gets heated up by that magma and comes back up. But as it does so, all of the dissolved metals precipitate out, and they form these blankets of metal deposits called volcanogenic massive sulfides. But the pipe at which all these metals are coming out, if they do come out to the surface, a lot of them deposit lower down, they come out as this black, billowing, dirty water. Or, to the view of us, submersed with a camera, they look like black smokers. Okay, so the black smokers of underwater, of rifting areas of the Earth's oceanic crust, the black smokers have with them a terrible concoction of chemistries. Really, I mean, we're going more towards poisonous gases, but this is a pretty poisonous material generally to life as we know it. It's very sulfur rich, it's very acidic, it's very full of metals, and again, sulfur. So this is, and then that sulfur that mixes with the ocean chemistry can form sulfuric acid, which leads to the acidity of the area. So what's very peculiar about this area that is so toxic to most of life that we know is that it has a rich and flourishing ecology surrounding it. The tube worms, right, the big white-looking clammy things, they're filter feeders, I believe, and they're filter feeding the methane and sulfur out of the system, I think, or they're filter feeding bacteria that feed off of those. I believe that's right. So there are methanogens, or types of bacteria that are feeding off of the metals and the sulfurs that are there. Because they are not oxygen, they're not aerobic bacteria. They don't need oxygen to use as their potential energy source. Instead, they use these other means, or methanogens is one group of those, and another way to talk about that whole group. Again, I'm no biologist. Is chemosynthesizers that are using chemicals and the potential gradients of hooking those up into molecules and then harvesting that energy from them, chemical synthesizing to extract energy, is one way that those creatures in that ecology make their living. So there's the bacteria, the tube worms, the crabs, I think there are ghosty crabs, something like that. So, but my point here is there's a rich ecology surrounding these that just baffled people when they first got there, right? That these black smokers, extremely high temperatures, and they know that the chemistry and the pH is really extreme, yet there's a living community of life. And those things are extreme then. They're living in extreme conditions. So one way to describe those is extremophiles, files for like, and extreme conditions. These are likers of extreme conditions. They can live in hot temperatures, so thermophiles, hot likers. They can chemosynthesize, and then some of those can reduce the methane in the area, the methane that's billowing out of the area, to extract their energy sources, so they don't need the sun. They don't photosynthesize, they chemosynthesize, and others. So this whole community of life then seems like, if you're looking for a warm little pond in the origin of life, like, hey, there's a whole bunch of cool stuff coming out of the bottom of the ocean, and this community has done really well with it and made themselves a living community. So maybe that is life's origins, are in those ecological systems from the bottom of the ocean where there's all these chemical nutrients coming out. However, those are, again, extremophiles. I think that the more common hypothesis today, rather than being born out of that type of chemical soup, that life evolved into that niche. That life, again, being able to get its foothold in some other way, that specializing into these extreme conditions is more biologically likely. Again, I'm no biologist, I'm no evolutionary biologist. These are, again, the multiple working hypotheses as I've been exposed to them through biologic means. I've not said anything about the rock record here, right? No fossils, no anything. This is all biologists and astrobiologists and biologic chemists playing their sort of thought process games. I mean, they're not games. This is scientific exploration that we're talking about by being able to do chemistry into the origins of life. How could this possibly be? Now, the last one here, and this is one that I will expand upon. If I don't have the next slide is the Urey-Miller hypothesis, then this is where we're going. Excuse me for being flustered about my slides. The fourth hypothesis here, multiple working hypothesis, is that life has origins in soil. Now, naturally, from the geologic perspective then, or rock perspective, this is one that's a lot more accessible for me as a geoscientist to think about because of soil and its properties. And really, the argument is this is actually the same as number 2. That this is the same as the warm little pond idea, or the proverbial primordial soup of chemical mixture that was there to give rise to amino acids and proteins, except the primary difference is that instead of this happening in, say, a shallow sea or a lagoon or some sort of condition like this of open water, that this was actually happening in the soil, and the water droplets in the wet soil particles or clays in the soil. That the warm little pond isn't, say, as big as this desk, but is as small as a water droplet, and many thousands and millions and quadrillions, googleplexes, of droplets of waters in the soil. Maybe not googleplexes. Okay. All right. I think we'll expand on this one here in just a second. Yes, Urey-Miller hypothesis. Or experiment. I'm so glad that I do have this. Again, I'm no biologist, and this is a limited understanding that I have of this. But here goes. The idea, both geologically and biologically, looking into Earth's origins, is that the atmosphere of the Earth was mostly these, what we consider noxious gases. It was mostly things like water vapor, not a noxious gas, but water vapor, methane, ammonia, hydrogen, with 2 hydrogen particles bonded together, and carbon monoxide, or some forms of these CO molecules, not carbon dioxide, but carbon monoxide. And that was what was thought to be the chemistry of the overall atmosphere. So what Urey and Miller did, I believe this is a graduate student and professor relationship, right? I think that Miller was the student, 1954. In this middle portion here of this schematic representation is that early atmosphere, the chemistry of the early Earth's atmosphere. And then notice that there's this lightning thing, or this electric spark that they're sparking in here. So they are synthetically inducing an electrical spark into this early Earth atmosphere. Now, they're not saying that there was any synthetically created electric spark, but there are plenty of naturally created electric sparks all the time. We call that lightning. And lightning is a common phenomena in the meteorologic system today, which is probably quite different from the meteorologic system of the Hadean or the Archean. However, what was very similar was probably volcanic lightning. Volcanism, because of the immense temperatures and because of the immense pressures and the chemistry, ionizes in the clouds, or the billowing pyroclastic materials coming out, forces ions to form, which causes lightning back and forth within the cloud and ground strikes. So volcanic lightning is a common phenomenon in a lot of these, especially pyroclastic eruptions, from at least what I've seen. And so what they're doing here is they're agreeing that volcanic lightning in the Earth's atmosphere was occurring. And let's see what happens when you pass an electrical current through that early atmosphere. So as they did that, and they volatilize or vaporize this material, of course causing a whole bunch of organic reactions to occur, because these are all organic molecules. Carbon and hydrogen together is organic. And they condensed that with a cold water cooler, and then trapped the material, and were able to separate the water away from the rest of the material and sample what was left over in that I guess leftover soup of a material, that primordial soup of material. What was it that was left over after this occurred? And what they found was pretty remarkable, absolutely remarkable, that through a spontaneous natural process, what formed from this after being able to cool was the special thing, the special building blocks of life, or basically life as we know it, the amino acids. The amino acids are the essential building blocks of proteins. So if you're familiar with diet and maybe not exercise, but just overall diet, and we need proteins, and we need what's called a complete protein. That complete protein is a combination of all of the amino acids that we lack. The ones that we can't make ourselves, or our body can't make, but instead we need to get from other things, like plants and animals. Animals, because they are made of flesh, they contain a complete protein in their flesh, or their muscle, or their meat when we eat chicken or beef. But plants have only parts of those complete proteins that an animal might need, so we have to eat a plethora of those to get it combined together to get a complete protein. But my point here is that protein, again, we know that from a food and a nutritional standpoint is one thing that we need to survive and to make muscle and to run our operational human beingness, right? And amino acids are the building blocks to those proteins, and through a very spontaneous, natural process, amino acids have been shown to form in the Earth's environment, okay? So, boom, close, story done, life has formed. Okay, right? That's the biologist's point of view, actually, and I don't mean to take that so exaggeratingly, but again, this is the most common story Not that it's wrong, but it is the cultural meme that we know of as the origins of life on this planet. And what this has led to is this very primitive look at the Hadean and the Archean of what the Earth's crust looks like, what the Earth's continents look like, the meteorologic system, the whole Earth systems. And I think this just tends to just lump it together and say, yeah, life rose out of the oceans, and what we want to do in Violent Earth all the way along the way is look at the details of these systems and how the systems are interacting to make a more complex story than what we're generally told. Or not told, but what we generally come across in our everyday searching. Now, this was also repeated again. This wasn't just an experiment of one. I want to point that out. They did plenty of experiments, published research. They also redid this in 1983, finding more amino acids. Again in 2010, finding even more. Not just the experiment itself, but also the a student of the student in this experiment, later with a student, I think in 2010, had inherited some of the original collection of this material and ran to see if any new amino acids had formed, or at least that they didn't have the method of acquiring last time. Maybe they being able to have more specialized means to look at lower concentrations. And anyway, we have many, many more amino acids that have been identified in that. Maybe not many, many more, but at least 25 were produced. So there's a nice introduction to the Urey-Miller synthesis from my geologic lens, I guess. Now, one of the common, I think, not holes, but one of the common critiques of this entire idea is that it takes about 1 billion years, it takes time. It takes a lot of time for this chemistry of the overall Earth to have enough of this stuff in this primordial, soupy, open, oceany, warm little pond area for this stuff to form. But remember, we have about 1 billion years of the Hadean, hell on Earth, to work with before we get the Archean types of crust in a more calmer system. So we have 1 billion years. That's a lot of time for something like this to happen. And I do think that that's a possible line to the overall story. Now, before we take a break here, you may be wondering, when are we getting to the poison gases? Well, that's coming in just a few minutes here. But I want to go back to my preferred hypothesis for life's origins here on Earth, or some other distant planet that had life form on that planet. And I would argue, we would argue, others have argued, I've heard this story, thank you, Dr. Greg Retallack, this argument, and I think this is one of the most plausible arguments of life's origins in soils. And so first we need to maybe expand the definitions of soils a little bit, because soils on this planet are considered things that can harbor plant growth or life. But if we take the organic stuff out of soil and we look at soil for what it really is, it's particles of substrate or of rock, originally rock, that have been altered in place. By in place, I just mean that there are mechanisms externally or from the top down gravitationally that can alter either chemically or physically into that substrate and overall make a layering of those types of particles chemically. And that's a soil. If you look at, say, the USDA's 13 soil classes, or I think there may be 15 soil classes now, they are classified by soil horizons. It's the horizons that help us look at how that soil formed in the past. What is the process there? Was that a desert process? Was that a forest process? And then those things help us look at soils in the past, the geologic history, or a science called paleopedology. So we have to expand our definition of soil to not include life, but instead to think about it as an alteration process by other physical means, not physical and chemical means, but not biological means. So soil, one of the classic pieces of soil chemistry and soil profiles is the formation of clay molecules, or the clay crystal. It's a very peculiar crystal. So I'll pick up there in just a second, but I do want to point out, I'll make sure that this paper is available on the Canvas website. The Origin of Life and the Nature of the Primitive Gene. This is really one of the pinnacle papers that does dive into this. This is 1966. That does dive into this idea of the gene, the primitive gene. And that's kind of where we're going with the idea of soils and clays. So the hypothesis here is that life's origins were in soils, and I should address this too, that this has kind of some obvious spiritual resonance. There are a lot of traditions around the world that have that have this within their mythology, right? Of say the Sumerian gods that molded things from clay that eventually became humans. That's how they made the humans, is molded them out of clay. Or we have maybe sayings like at death, from dust you came and from dust you shall return. And so there's a larger, being an agrarian society or an agriculturally based society, soil is very, very important for us to grow crops. And a lot of religious mythologies draw from that idea of agriculture being in food being important and soil therefore being important, so maybe that's where we came from. Now, this hypothesis isn't meaning to validate any of that sort of idea and say, hey, look, all the major world religions are right, or spiritualities are right. See, they've been telling you soil was the mother all the way along. This is sort of a different way to look at that as, well, that's a nice story that soil bore us, right? That soil is our mother. But let's look at the details of that story. I don't care what philosophical means you want to draw from this, the idea that soils may be the origins of life, but let's look at the details that support that very simple idea. So I mentioned clays. The clay particle is, here's a scanning electron image of a clay particle. And so this is very, 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 very close. I should have put a scale bar on here, but this is, this is micrometers in distance that we're looking at. The clay particle that's right here should look kind of just like a stack of papers. That's what it looks like to me every time I see this picture. That's still what I kind of think of, is just a stack of papers that's maybe wet. Right? Maybe it got wet. Maybe the ream of paper was sitting under a window and it rained on the window and now all the paper is clumpy and stuck together. But some of those sheets are kind of falling off in big clumps. I don't know. That's my analogy. So think of clays like sheets of paper. That's actually the clay crystal. If we go back to week 1 when we talked about the diversity of crystals and minerals that are out there, there's the micas, or the phyllosilicates, the sheet silicates that flake or cleave into sheets because of their chemistry and the way they're bonded together. And clays are exactly that. They're a micaceous style of crystal. I mean, they're quite a bit different at their micro level of chemistry, but the point is that they are phyllosilicates that form in these sheets. A major difference is that clays form on the surface of the earth at atmospheric temperatures and pressures, where micas form from magmas. They form from precipitating lavas and magmas. So clays, being a surficial thing, is very different from being a magma thing, but they share that similar quality that they're like these sheets of paper or sheets. So that's a very interesting you can fit lots of sheets of paper together. So you can have lots of stacks of clay crystals together, but then also they can peel apart. And that little stack, that could contain 125 sheets of paper. a ream of paper. I don't know if that's the exact amount, but my point here is that contains a whole lot, like a newspaper. It's got all this stuff. It's a whole bunch of stuff if you spread it all out, but it condenses into a nice little thing. Clays do something very similar. When you wet them, they stick together. They absorb all of that moisture, but then they can desiccate, and all that moisture can go back into the atmosphere, and those little sheets of paper can individually fly away, right, with their structural means intact. Okay? Now, if you, that ream of paper, if you instead poured maybe inky water on there, and then you let them dry out, the piece of paper that's flying away might not have water in it anymore, but it still has the ink, right? It still has the chemistry of the ink that was there. So then you have 125 sheets of paper that are flying away, inky paper, right? I'm kind of going somewhere with that analogy. So clays, having this type of crystal to them is very peculiar and is very different than a lot of surficial materials, but this is ultimately what becomes of most surficial materials. Feldspars, olivine, many minerals that can be, or micas themselves, many minerals that can be chemically weathered by water and oxygen on the surface of the earth eventually form clays. This is why clays are so prominent in soils. As a soil is forming and water reacts with the feldspars on the surface, that forms clays that go down in the soil horizon and accumulate in the B horizon. And it leaves up above all this leached out material that's the leftover junk of the feldspar. Okay, so clays are one of the primary surficial weathering new minerals to form in a soil. And you could argue that happens on Mars, and that happens on the moon, because this is just a top-down process. Let's take water out of it, for instance, and instead have this as air, or hydrogen if you're on the moon, right? It's not air, it's not much of an atmosphere, but there is still some gravitational downward movement of whatever particles are there. And meteors or micrometeors that are slamming into the moon are making dust. Small little bits of regolith or moon dust that, the first man on the moon put his boot print in, right? All of that accumulated material does have a down or a top-down process of formation where those fine particles can accumulate. Now, I'm not arguing that those are clays. Those are not clays. Those are just ground, silty material. But let's look at Mars, or think about Mars. Then Mars, very similarly, even in the absence of water, which Mars has water today, it's fine. Mars has clays because Mars had water, or it still has water today. But even in the processes that are occurring in the atmosphere on Mars today, there's a top-down reaction of the materials in the atmosphere down into the rock substrate. The hematite, the presence of hematite that's there, and so on. Okay, now enough about other soils on other planets. Let's come back to our planet and the role that clay plays in the formation of amino acids or of life. Okay, we went through a whole lot of properties of clays right there. I want to highlight a few, and that's that they absorb moisture. Okay, clay is that stuff that when you're at an auto mechanic shop and there's spilled oil, the gray stuff that you put on there to soak up the spill, or say, like that kid in second grade that barfed on the floor and the janitor had to throw the gray stuff on there, or kitty litter, right? All of that stuff is a moisture absorber or a desiccator that are oftentimes made out of clays, or maybe even a volcanic ash that has been altered into a clay. And those clays can suck up the moisture. Aha! But it's oil. It's not water. It's not just moist water. It's also organic material. It can suck up oil. It can suck up stomach bile. Ooh, gross. Okay, it can suck up kitty pee-pee, right? It's sucking up anything that's dissolved in the water, any organic materials or even just ions that are floating in solution, potassium molecules and sodium molecules that are independently from those feldspar reactions in the water. It can suck those up and swell. That's what clays also do, is they swell up with all that stuff. I think of the mineral bentonite. Probably people haven't always worked about that. Hasn't everybody worked with bentonite? Or let's just stick with kitty litter. Maybe that's a more commonly used thing. When it absorbs that moisture, it does swell. I don't have another great example for the swelling other than using bentonite on cattle troughs. Okay, so my point here is it absorbs moisture and it absorbs organic material. I guess that's point number one about clays. Now, remember that as that piece of paper, as it dries out and it flies away, or that clay crystal, it dries out and it flies away, it can also fly away with the ink intact, or the organic material that's still in there intact, and it goes away. Now, clays have another really unusual process, and that is when they swell up with material that's in the water. If those are potassium or sodium ions that are in solution, if that clay crystal has sodium or potassium in its crystalline lattice, it can use those ions as part of its crystal lattice. And that clay can actually grow. It can grow wider. It can grow thicker by putting on more sheets. Well, this goes back to how clays form in the soil process. Of course they do that, right? Of course that clays are expanding not just by swelling material up, but also in their chemical means of building, just like a crystal would in a magma. These are just precipitating ions and making themselves larger or thicker. And I don't mean to anthropomorphize here and say they're growing, they're making themselves bigger. Okay, we want to avoid stuff like that, but we are left with the language that we have to describe that. So I maybe shouldn't use words like they, but I think that you know where I'm getting and going with all of it, right? So what clays also do is they create a template, the clay crystal, for all these loosely floating cations to bond to make more crystal. Okay, and remember, if they're making themselves thicker, they're making a new sheet under here. They come in contact with enough chemical material to make a new sheet. Well, then that sheet can dry out and fly away, right? The brand new crystal goes off somewhere else. And what does it do when it goes somewhere else? It's a template for making more of itself. So clays are an incredibly diverse mineral group. Incredibly diverse. I don't know, maybe 5 clays that I can list myself, maybe even less. Because there are thousands of different, very diverse types of clay grains, particles, crystals that are out there. And this is why. Because everything that they come into contact with, they just make into a different crystal in a different shape. Maybe I'm exaggerating. There may not be thousands of types of clays, but I wouldn't be surprised. And my point here is that those materials that the clay is soaking up with it, it can make more of those materials if it comes into contact with the right chemistry. Okay? Now, think of what the implications that this has for the organic materials that are soaked up with that clay. If it soaks up some, say, methane, for instance, and it has a methane particle, and it floats away, and then it comes into contact with a carbon and hydrogen, an anion and cation and anions, it can put those cations and anions like a template as it does in its original template. It can put them and bond them together to make an identical replication. And this replication of the clay grains is why clays have been called the crystal gene, or the non-living gene. That's what genes do in our bodies. They tell our DNA to make replicas, right? And it makes a whole bunch of different replicas of that same thing that it wants it to do through those biologic means. And the clay grain apparently does a very similar thing but non-living in a silicate fashion. And the clay grain can also potentially do that with organic compounds. It can make not new organic compounds, but it can make the same organic compounds if it comes into contact with them. So it can replicate as the crystal gene. It can make more organic compounds that it has come into contact with previously. So in the little moist droplets of water between clay crystals or in clay crystals that is being absorbed and exchanged and replicated, at some point, those of us that support this hypothesis or that prefer this hypothesis would suggest that clays were originally responsible for maybe not organizing the amino acid, but making the pool small enough so the likelihood, the probabilities were much higher for amino acid number 1 to form, and then for that to go and create replicas of more amino acid 1s. And then at least we have a lot of those. And then for that process to repeat several other times, right, 20, 25, 32 of the amino acids, and then those amino acids to again in more create proteins. Now I'm not going to touch that one with a 90-foot pole. I don't have that great of a background in biologic chemistry and physical chemistry, organic chemistry, but the leap from the amino acid to protein I think is a much bigger leap. At this point for the biologic sciences, we can do it in the atmosphere of the Earth. So this really isn't a problem. It's just in a different place, in a different means. But there is a big jump to getting to proteins. From my understanding that amino acids to organize into proteins and long complex polypeptides is another complex process. Now, why do I not want to go into that? Because that's not something the rock record can say much about, right? Unless we're using the same process. I am arguing as a geoscientist, as other geoscientists do, that just the process of clays, this geospheric process, can lay the framework and the scaffolding for life to form on this planet. So the rock record of soils does have something to say about this, because that is a mechanism that soil can do. Okay? So we have the origins of life in soils, would be my preferred hypothesis. Same as the warm little pond, the most supported Urey-Miller synthesis, and so on. Now, what does the continued rock record have to say about this? Well, by 3.48 billion years ago, and this is a date that continually people are looking for these types of fossils to push this date further and further back. But by 3.48 billion years ago, certainly there are a number of these things in the rock record, and this is in the Pilbara Craton of Australia, I believe, a very ancient craton of clearly very old rocks that are exposed here, that the earliest signs of life on land preserve about 3.5 billion years ago in unique environments for preservation, like hot spring deposits. Again, maybe thermophiles. So life, if thermophiles are a diversified type of life, then life has been going for a little while to diversify into that. And similarly, these algal mats or biolaminates, or these algal crusts that leave these soil-like crusts behind that have fossilized in the rock record, which we have modern-day analogies for those. They show really well in this paper. These things in this particular rock unit in this area in Australia are plentiful. That there are a lot of these. So clearly this area, this one little depositional pond, this one little area, maybe a couple hundred meters, maybe a couple 100 kilometers wide or something, had life that was prolific enough to leave behind evidence in the rock record. Just because this is 3.48 billion years ago doesn't mean that, boom, life showed up at 3.5. Boom, it partied on the scene. What this means is this is the maximum amount that we can see in the rock record that life had come about at some time before. Okay, so this isn't putting a maximum end on life's formation. And again, we're continuing to look at the rocks that are slightly older than this for these types of evidences. But what this is saying is that life had gotten a foothold enough, and however it did, panspermia, warm little pond and soil, so on and so forth, that by this time, it was able to live in large, complex communities like algal mats, and to disturb the sediments enough to make these types of sedimentary structures, which are called microbial-induced sedimentary structures, MISS. Okay, you'll see that abbreviated in some of the materials later. So, however life's origins, whatever your preferred hypothesis for life's origins, we can see in the rock record of this violent Earth that by 3.5 billion years ago, life has a foothold on this planet. And the next segment, we are going to talk about the chemistry of this life, right? What is this life doing to the environment? We know that life affects and is affected by the environment. So we want to see what that delicate balance or that affecting and being affected by life is introducing into the Earth systems. So in the first day of this class, we talked about what I like to call the Earth systems and Earth system sciences and the spheres, right? The heliosphere, which we've talked plenty about, the geosphere that we stand on, the rock of Earth, the hydrosphere, the water, which we've talked a limited amount about, and then the atmosphere, right? The gaseous phase of the Earth. Those are the four that then combine together to form the fifth, or life. And up until this point, then, the Earth system has been operating in the absence of that fifth one, of life. So if you throw a new system into this, that has to change the rest of the systems in some way for this one to continue, right? And the next segment will be then focused on what happens when you let a bunch of organisms loose into Earth systems. Okay?